All right, welcome back. This is program number 14 in our Accelerated NLP training series. Now we move into timeline therapy, which is a very, very powerful technique for assisting clients in letting go of negative emotions and also to get rid of limiting decisions, as well as showing the client specific ways for creating their future. And although this segment is not intended to be a complete training in timeline therapy, I think it'll serve as a rather good introduction for you. As NLP practitioners, I think timeline therapy is a very important part of neuro-linguistic programming, and I think it's a part probably which would be a good idea for you to know how to do. At least if you come and take the practitioner training, you'll be getting a thorough grounding in how to do it. And so let's move right into it. Let's turn to page 75 and look at the process of the elicitation of the timeline. We've already talked about the prime directives of the unconscious mind, and of course those serve as a presuppositional basis for timeline therapy, or they serve as some presuppositions as to the intent and how the unconscious mind works. So remembering that the intent here in using timeline therapy is to be able to assist the unconscious mind in letting go of negative emotions and limiting decisions, I think one of the things that's important to say is that in doing timeline therapy, we want to be working primarily with the unconscious mind. I began the research on timeline therapy about 1984, 1985, 86. I wrote the book on timeline therapy, the first book on timeline therapy in 1987, and it was published in 1988 as Timeline Therapy and the Basis of Personality. I then wrote a subsequent book to that called The Secret of Creating a Future, which is really about creating future sorts of things, and I wrote that in 1989. So we've been doing timeline therapy now for quite a while. And we've got a pretty good knowledge base and a pretty good experience base. We have timeline therapy trainers all over the world and people doing timeline therapy with clients all over the world and getting absolutely great results. So we know that timeline therapy works and it always produces the kind of results that you want to produce, assuming you contextualize the results properly and you know what it is that you're aiming for. So the very first thing I think that you need to know in working with a client's timeline is where the timeline is. In other words, how to elicit it. And at page 75 here, it says, we do this with the client awake and not in trance. And the purpose of that section of doing it awake and not in trance is to increase unconscious trust and cooperation. If we actually had the client in a deep trance before we elicited their timeline, then probably what would happen is that they would be, they wouldn't remember it fully. So what we want is we want the client not in trance for much of timeline therapy and for them to be communicating with their unconscious mind and receiving answers and having the unconscious mind answer them. And the unconscious mind says certain things to them. You get certain answers from the unconscious mind, or the client's unconscious mind gives them certain answers, which in that sense are pretty good. The client, and then the client goes, whoa, where did that come from? I didn't know that I had that sort of ability to talk to my unconscious mind and to get those kinds of answers easily and comfortably from the unconscious mind. So we elicit the client's timeline with the client awake, in essence, not in trance and not zoned out, and where they can answer and where they can actually respond to us and get a conscious sort of unconscious integration. And that's essentially what we're looking for. I've provided you, once again, with scripts, and I think the best way to learn timeline therapy is with scripts. I don't require that you follow the scripts, but I do think that the best way for one to learn timeline therapy is to use a script because the languaging is so critical. Timeline therapy is, at least in part, based on the language you use. And if the language you use is at all sloppy, which sometimes it is for some practitioners, then sometimes the results that we get aren't as good as they could be. And we really do want the results to be as good as they possibly can be. We really want the results to be top quality and top flight results. Okay. So let's look and see what we say. If I were to ask your unconscious mind where your past is and where your future is, I have an idea that you might say it's from right to left, or from front to back, or up to down, or in some direction from you in relation to your body. And it's not your conscious concept that I'm interested in, it's your unconscious. So if I were to ask your unconscious mind, where's your past? To what direction would you point? And that's the first question you ask. And I think you always want to note all analog behavior. Analog behavior means how they gesture. Do they move their head in a certain direction? I had one client who leaned backwards and said, I don't know where my past is, and leaned forward and says, I'm not sure where my future is. One client gesturing with his hand off to the client's right said, I'm not sure where my past is, and then moved his hand to the left and said, I'm not sure where my future is. So pay attention to what the client's doing with their body. Pay attention to their physiology. You may get some clues there. Once you've got the direction and location of the past, then you say, and your future. What direction would you point to if I asked your unconscious mind, where's your future? Now, I think it's a pretty good thing to spend at least 15 to 20 minutes on this point of view of elicitation, to do it right at this point, and to spend that much time because it will be well repaid with the amount of time that you save later on doing timeline therapy. Now, I think as you elicit the client's timeline, you need to make sure that you understand that however your client does it, that is, however they organize the past and the future, is perfect for your client. You should really make no value judgments about the organization of your client's timeline until you find out how it works for your client. If the client's timeline is not part of the presenting problem, then by all means, you don't need to change it and don't need to make changes to it. And clients will say to you, oh, my timeline does this and this. I had one client, it's a corkscrew. It twirls around me like a corkscrew. And then they'll say to you the telling question, is that okay? And of course, the answer is yes. You always ought to say, whenever a client asks you any question, is that okay? Or is that okay with my timeline? The answer is yes, it's perfect. However the client does it for them is perfect. I think you should make no value judgments, even if you try on their timeline and you would say to yourself, wow, I just can't possibly see how that organization of timeline could possibly work for me or for anyone else for that matter. And of course, how could it? It might or it might not. But the fact is that however it works, if it isn't part of the presenting problem, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Just let it be there. Okay, so let's do this together, you and me. Let's do this together. Let's do this together. I'll ask you the questions and you just sort of check out and see where your timeline is. So, and let's do it. If I were to ask your unconscious mind where your past is and where your future is, I have an idea you might say it's from right to left, or from front to back, or up to down, or in some direction from you in relationship to your body. And it's not your conscious concept I'm interested in, it's your unconscious. So if I were to ask your unconscious mind, where's your past? To what direction would you point? And as you're listening to the tapes, why don't you go ahead and point to that direction just so that you know you know. Good, okay. And now how about your future? What direction would you point if I asked your unconscious mind, where's your future? Okay, good. So that's how we elicit the timeline. It's very simple. And I think it's worth, some clients might say to you, well, I have no idea where my past is. And I'm honestly surprised when someone says that. Because I know in the book, How People Perceive Time, which was written in 1978, there were a couple of psychologists who did a standard psychological study about time. And what they discovered was that an astounding 98% of all people in North America that they studied had timelines or spatial orientation with regards to time, where they knew where their past was and their future was, and they could simply point to it. Now, I think you're probably not going to get any of the other 2% who didn't know, but virtually 98% of the people who they interviewed had a real clear idea of where the past was for them and where the future was for them. That means that 98% of all the people that you talk to really should have the ability to find their timeline easily. And someone who's probably coming to you as a client is clearly going to find that it's easy to do. Now, the next question is, can you float above the timeline? So we go to page 76. And page 76, we ask them to bring to mind the directions that you pointed to. or the memories of the past and future that you noticed? And did you notice they imply a line? And if the client says no, you say, well, could you notice that? And if the client says no, you say, well, is your past arranged by location? For example, where you lived. And if the client says yes, you say, well, how would it look for purposes of this process if it were stretched out in a line? Now remember that timeline therapy is not only a visual process. It can be done visually or auditorily or kinesthetically. I need to tell you a story here at this point about a football player that I worked with in Dallas. And this guy was a major athlete, a really solid athlete, and real kinesthetic. He didn't have any pictures in his head at all. In fact, I said to him, we were listening to the timeline, I said to him, do you make pictures in your head? And he goes, nope, never did, never will. And I went, whoa, okay, no problem. And so I asked him, I said, where's your past? And he pointed to it, where's your future? He floated up above his timeline and went back before the first event, quicker than most visuals. It was kind of like this. I said, okay, go ahead and float up above your timeline, go back before the first event. He goes, yup. I went, are you there? He goes, yup. I said, so turn and look toward now. Where's the negative emotion? He said, it's gone. I said, that quickly? He goes, yep. So I said, come on back to now. He goes, okay. I said, are you back at now? He said, yeah. I said, you let go of all the negative emotion on the way back? He said, yep, it's gone. He was way quicker than most of the visuals I've ever worked with. So number one, don't let people tell you that kinesthetic is a slow representational system, because it isn't. And don't let anybody who's kinesthetic tell you they can't do it because it's a visual process. And that's what this paragraph is about, this next paragraph. It says good. Now, when I say line, I don't mean to imply only visual, because in a moment I'm going to ask you to float up above that line. And by float, I also mean as sounds floating on the wind, or floating in the bathtub, or visually. However you float above your timeline is perfect. So can you just float up above your timeline, and remaining above your timeline, float back into the past? And then you see where it says pause? You don't read that, okay? So you just pause for a moment. Pause, pause, pause. Are you there? Client says yes. You say good, and now float out into your future. And you pause. Are you there? Client says yes. You say good. Now float up higher. Float up so high that your timeline looks like 1 inch long. Pause. Client says okay. You say good. Now float back to now, float down into now, and come back in the room. How was that? And the client will say either that was easy, that was really easy, or oh, that was so hard. And whatever the client says, you say very good. And if the client says that was hard, you say, well, don't make this any easier. Then you realize you got value from the process. So sometimes clients have a vested interest in this sort of work being hard, and they can make it as hard as they want. And that's fine with us. So they can make it just as hard as they want to make it. Okay, so you guys want, let's do this together. Let's do this together, you and me. You ready? I'm going to put on a little timeline therapy music. This is our timeline therapy music for floating above the timeline. And I think probably it'd be a lot of fun just for us to go ahead and have you do this first test of elicitation, which is simply floating right above the timeline. Let's do this together. I'll ask you the questions, and you just sort of check out and see where your timeline is. So, and let's do it. If I were to ask your unconscious mind where your past is and where your future is, I have an idea you might say it's from right to left, or from front to back, or up to down, or in some direction from you in relationship to your body. And it's not your conscious concept I'm interested in, it's your unconscious. So if I were to ask your unconscious mind, where's your past, to what direction would you point? And as you're listening to the tapes, why don't you go ahead and point to that direction, just so that you know you know. Good, okay. And now how about your future? What direction would you point if I asked your unconscious mind, where's your future? Okay, good. So that's how we elicit the timeline. It's very simple. And I think it's worth, some clients might say to you, well, I have no idea where my past is. And I'm honestly surprised when someone says that. Because I know in the book, How People Perceive Time, which was written in 1978, there were a couple of psychologists who did a standard psychological study about time. And what they discovered was that an astounding 98% of all people bring to mind the directions you pointed to a moment ago, the directions of the past and the future. And what I'd like you to notice is that they imply a line. Okay, just notice they imply a line. Now, when I say line, I don't mean to imply only visual, because in a moment I'm going to ask you to float up above that line. And by float, I also mean as sounds floating on the wind, or floating in the bathtub, or visually. However you float above your timeline is perfect. So, can you just go ahead and float up above your timeline? Just go ahead and float right up above your timeline. Way up in the air. Just float right up above your timeline, and remaining above your timeline, just float back into the past. Right back into the past. All the way back in the past. In fact, if you wanted to, you could go right back to the beginning end of your timeline, if that were easy to get to. Good. And then, why don't you just go ahead and float out into your future? So just float all the way out into your future. Just float all the way out into your future. Good. Now float up higher. Why don't you float up so high that your timeline looks as though it's only 1 inch long? Just float up so high that your timeline looks as though it's only 1 inch long. Good. And then float back to now. Just float down into now and come on back in the room. Okay, welcome back. Welcome back. How was that? So just notice how it was. Some folks will find that it was rather easy. Some folks will find that it was rather tough. Remember, if it was easy for you, that's good. If it wasn't easy for you, then make it only as easy as that you know that you got value from it. Now, I would say, the only thing I would say that would be different if you were doing this with a client, from what I just demonstrated, is if you were doing it with a client, you'd want to calibrate the client. Since you and I aren't in the same room, not physically anyway, and that I can't see you, then I left some spaces in the tape for roughly how long I thought it would take. If you were moving faster than that, then I would want to be just as fast, so that by the time you got up all the way up, so that your timeline looks like it was 1 inch long, then we'd say, are you there? You'd go yes, and we'd have you float back down into now and come back in the room as quickly as that happens. Yeah, so you want to stay with the client. That's the intent. Okay. Let's look at page 77 now and look at how to discover the root cause. Timeline therapy is an extremely powerful set of techniques for letting go of negative emotions from the past and limiting decisions. How would you like to let go of all your negative emotions from the past? I mean, can you imagine that? What would happen if you got rid of all of your negative emotions from the past? Let's just say, for example, that you got rid of, or even for a client, let's just say you got rid of anger and sadness and fear. Maybe you got rid of hurt and guilt too. All the negative emotions that used to plague you or that plagued you and a client. What if you got rid of all of those? What if those just totally disappeared and they were no more in your life or in your client's life? You think that would make a difference in someone's life? Whoa, I do. I mean, imagine, take a salesperson who has fear of closing. And so this salesperson has fear of closing. They go into a closing situation and they don't close because they're afraid to. What if we assisted that client in letting go of his or her fear from the past? What if, I mean, think about this for just a minute. What if you were getting into a new relationship, but you brought some emotional baggage with you? Oh no, really? But who hasn't? I mean, all of us have stuff that happened in the past, and you go to get into a new relationship and you bring your baggage with you, almost as if you're carrying a couple suitcases worth of it. And you carry this suitcase with you and you walk up to your newfound friend and you say, "Hi, I'm Tad, and this is my emotional baggage." So what if you could get rid of all your emotional baggage before you got into a relationship, so you could move into the new relationship happily and easily and comfortably? Well, of course, that's what timeline therapy is about. Timeline therapy is about letting go of the past. It's about letting go of the past negative emotions like anger and sadness and fear and guilt, which improve our relationships in the present. And it's also about letting go of limiting decisions like I'm not good enough, or the kind of decision of I can't have what I want. Timeline therapy is about easily letting go of all of that too. And the way we do that in timeline therapy is the first thing we do is we find out what's the root cause. What's the root cause of a certain event or a certain negative emotion specifically? And so let's look at page 77. To talk about this, I think we first need to talk about how the unconscious mind organizes events at the unconscious level. If you notice the diagram here underneath the timeline, it says the Gestalt. And the word Gestalt in this context means a collection of memories around a certain subject. The sum total of those memories are going to be greater than the individual effects of the memories themselves. The Gestalt is the way the unconscious mind simply organizes materials and makes associations at the unconscious level. Now, the first time you ever felt frustration, for example, let's take frustration as an example. Your unconscious mind didn't have any way to encode that. So it simply kept it at the unconscious level. And on your diagram here, that's where it says first event. Then what happened is the next time you had frustration, it had another event. So maybe it chained them together. By the time you had a third and fourth event of frustration, it clearly had a Gestalt started. Now, some of the events along the way are going to be significant emotional events, and I've labeled a couple of them here as significant emotional events. And some of them are not going to be significant emotional events. The significant emotional events are going to be the events probably that you remember, the events that are most memorable to you, the events that you go, "Oh yeah, now I remember when that happened," and blah, 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 blah. So the significant emotional events are going to be the significant ones. Other events may not even be memorable to you. You may not have any memory at all of events which weren't particularly significant. But the first event, as far back as we have to look, the first event is always going to be the very first event that occurred. So in doing timeline therapy, what we have to do is we have to go back before that first event. We have to find out when the first event was, and then floating above the timeline, we simply go back to where the first event was, and we let go of the negative emotions that are present on that first event. We let go of the negative emotions that were present on that first event, and then we let go of all the negative emotions on every subsequent event after that. Now the question, of course, may come up, well, where was that first event? How far back was it? Was it after your birth sometime? And if you look at the diagram here, you'll notice there in the gray box underneath the timeline, it says 0 to 7 imprint, 7 to 14 modeling, and 14 to 21 socialization. These time periods are from Dr. Morris Massey. And Massey says that a personality is formed by the significant emotional events in our past. He believes that most of our significant emotional events happen before age 10. And he calls 0 to 7 the imprint period, where essentially we're imprinted upon like little cookies cut up by little cookie cutters. And the cookie cutters are our parents and the environment. So we get modeled, or we get simply imprinted by that very first series of events. And then from 7 to 14, we begin to branch out and look at people around us, and we begin to model them. And then from 14 to 21 is a socialization period where we socialize with members of the opposite sex and members of the same sex, where we begin to pick up some of our social values and social ideas. Now, I think if we're working with a major negative emotion like anger and sadness or fear and guilt, I think that they're going to have a first event in that 0 to 7 time period. I think as the practitioner of timeline therapy and NLP, you should be looking for that first period, that imprint period, for when that very first event is. It's possible that a person could have their first event for anger at age 7, but gosh, think back to if you've seen any babies. When they get wet or when they get frustrated, they get angry. And so I think that some of our first events have got to be between 0 and 7. There's also another possibility. If you look at that very small period just to the left of the word past in the timeline, it says womb. And so there was a 9-month period, for some of you 8, for some of you 10-month period, where we were in the womb. And at that point, we made decisions and we had negative emotions just in the same way as if we weren't in the womb. Now, this may sound funny, but I've actually had clients who had first events for negative emotions in the womb. The most interesting one to me was one fellow who had a decision that he made early on in being in the womb where he decided not to make any money. And this client came to me and he said, Tad, I've never made as much money as I should. I've always felt that I was real successful in relationships, but he said, I've never made the kind of money I should. I've never made the kind of money I deserve, and I'm really better than the amount of money that I'm making. So can you assist me to clear that up and to make more money? Well, I said, sure we can. So what we did was I simply asked him when was the first event for this, and he said, well, coming up that I made this decision sometime in the womb. And I said, wow, in the womb, now that's pretty intense. So I had him float back into the event, back into the past and down into the event. And the intervention for limiting decisions actually has the client float down into the event. And then I have to admit I got curious. Timeline therapy isn't necessarily about finding out what the content was, but I have to admit that I personally got curious. And so while he was in the womb, inside his little body in the womb, letting go of the negative emotions or getting ready to let go of the negative emotions and the limiting decisions that were present with that decision that it wasn't okay to make enough money, I asked him, I said, what's going on? And he said, I'm hearing two people arguing about money. And he said, and I am saying to myself, if that's what money does to relationships, I don't want any. And the fact is that his entire life he had had great relationships, but he hadn't made the amount of money that he thought he deserved. So in fact, here's a guy who his entire life had made a decision when he was in the womb to not make enough money. Then his entire life he really didn't have enough money, but he always had great relationships. Okay, so we found that out. Then I said to him, because I was just still so curious, I said, float outside of your mother's tummy and tell me what's going on. And he says, oh my God, she's watching a movie. So we floated him back above the timeline. We got the learnings necessary for him to let go of that limiting decision and let go of that negative emotion. And then I said to him, why don't you come back to now above your timeline and let go of any and all negative emotions related to this limiting decision and any other limiting decisions that would prevent you from making a lot of money. So he comes all the way back to now and floated down in the room and came back to now. Within the next month, his income had doubled. Now, the question that always comes up for me and that I generally get asked in seminars was, is this real? Now, I want to point out to you one thing, that this client didn't really care if it was real. I got to be honest with you. He didn't really care if this was a real event or not. One of the things we've said, and we said this in the prime directives of the unconscious mind, that the unconscious mind, the memories of the unconscious mind stores are largely symbolic. So the fact is that this may or may not have been real, but in its not reality, or in its reality, it's still, to be honest with you, it's still absolutely affected his income. So that his income was affected. His income was affected in a way that it kept him from making the kind of money he should have. His income was still affected, and he still didn't make the kind of money he deserved, which I thought was quite interesting. So the fact is that timeline therapy allows us to let go of negative emotions like anger, sadness, fear, and guilt, and get rid of limiting decisions, all of which affect us in the present. Okay, so we've looked at the imprint period, looked at the modeling period, the socialization period in the womb. There's another couple of possibilities. If you look on the left-hand side of the timeline now, you'll notice it says past lives and genealogical. There's not a lot of precedence for either of these in Western psychology, but in Eastern psychology, both of these are taken into account. Past lives are a notion that in past lives we may have made decisions that come on and affect us now. And the truth is, it doesn't even matter if you believe in it as a client yourself or as a practitioner, or even if your client's conscious mind doesn't believe in it. What really matters is that does the client's unconscious mind believe that the first effect or the first event came from a past life. I was working with a woman one time, and she came to my office and she said, Tad, I'm a Catholic and I'm a psychologist. And she said, as a Catholic, a practicing Catholic and a psychologist, she said, I've read your book. And she said, and I've read your book on past lives, and I've noticed the past life stuff in there, your timeline therapy book. And she said, and I'm a Catholic and a psychologist, and I don't believe in either one of them, so don't give me any of that crap. And I said, okay, no problem. I'm willing to do it any way the client wants to do it. And so it was fine with me. So I said to her, okay, so go ahead. And I said to her, when was the first event for this negative emotion we're working on? And she said, well, she said, you know, what's coming up? She said, it's past life. And she said, is that possible? And I said, well, I don't know. Let's find out. So she floated above her timeline. We went back in the past, got rid of the negative emotion, came back to now. And the fact is the emotion disappeared so completely and so cleanly. And then she said to me, you know, it's so funny. She said, I thought that event was in a past life. Well, wouldn't you know it, her unconscious mind had a sense of humor. I mean, her unconscious mind had a real sense of humor in giving her just the thing that she said she didn't believe in giving her just the thing that she said she didn't want to work on. And her unconscious mind says to her, well, this is where the first event was. Fortunately, she had enough sense, and I guess her experience as a psychologist, to where she said, okay, if my unconscious mind gives it to me, that's what I'm going to work on. The problem comes where clients and also sometimes NLP practitioners second guess the notion because they don't believe in past lives. And I think so as a practitioner of NLP and a practitioner of timeline therapy, I think you need to let the client tell you whatever they tell you and go along with it. If a client says the first event is in a past life, or if your unconscious mind says it's in a past life, then you really should go along with it. Now, how about a genealogical past? There's no precedence in Western psychology for genealogical pasts, but in the Chinese and the Japanese systems, it's very, very important to align with the ancestors. And alignment with the ancestors is like really, really vital. It's something that they really work on. And even in the Hawaiian system, there's a process called ho'oponopono. In the Huna system, the process of ho'oponopono, where it's really important to align all of the ancestors and clear up all the relationships in the genealogical past. And that's part of Huna, of course. So all of these techniques have as their basis aligning with and cleaning up and clearing up the genealogical past or the genealogical history of the client and aligning with the ancestors. And so the timeline therapy technique of if the client says, of course, that the first event is in a genealogical past, the timeline therapy technique would essentially deal with that and make sure that we go back and handle that. So your timeline is organized in a gestalt, and the first event for the gestalt could be as far back as the client says it is. Oh, I want to mention one other thing. I had one client, of course, and how far back could this possibly be? Well, I had one client who said to me, as if to say, here, you try to top this, Tad. He said, I think I've had this problem forever. And so I said, good, float above your timeline and go back to the beginning of time. And keep going. When you get to the beginning of time, keep going on further past that. And so he went back there and the negative emotion disappeared. So as far back as the client says the first event is, that's how far back we're going to go above the timeline to assist the client in letting go of those negative emotions. Now, this entire section that we're about to go through here on page 77, it says here, this section is done before the client's above the timeline. And again, the purpose of it is to increase conscious, unconscious trust and cooperation. We want the conscious mind to be able to ask the unconscious mind certain questions and get certain answers from the unconscious mind, with the conscious mind present and the unconscious mind giving those answers to the conscious mind. So the first question we're going to ask, and we start off here on page 77, whenever we're doing any negative emotion or any limiting decision, we always come back to this page. And we always ask at the beginning, is it all right for your unconscious mind for you to release this emotion today and for you to be aware of it consciously? Or if we're working on a limiting decision, we say, is it all right for your unconscious mind for you to release this limiting decision today and for you to be aware of it consciously? All right, then we go back and we're going to ask the client, we say, what is the root cause of this problem? The client says yes, and we go right into step number 2. We say to the client, what is the root cause of this problem? The first event which, when disconnected, will cause the problem to disappear. If you were to know, was it before, during, or after your birth? If the client says before birth, then you say in the womb or before. If the client says in the womb, then you say what month. If the client says before, then you say, was it a past life or was it passed down to you genealogically? If the client says it was a past life, you say how many lifetimes ago. And if the client says genealogical, then you say how many generations ago. And if the client says it was after the client's birth, then you say, if you were to know, what age were you? And then here it says go on to the next page. Obviously, you wouldn't read that, right? Once you got that. Now, here's some notes. If the client says, I don't know what the root cause is, Of course, I'm surprised. Almost in the same way if the client says, I don't know where my past is and I don't know where my future is, I'm truly surprised. And I say, you don't? Oh, yeah, that's because you're evaluating this with your conscious mind. And I want you to evaluate it with your unconscious mind. Client says, I don't know what the root cause is. You say, well, I know you don't. But if you did, take whatever comes up. Just trust your unconscious mind. The fact is that we're wanting the client to simply trust his or her unconscious mind and to begin to take whatever comes up. The first time you work with the unconscious mind, if you've never worked with the unconscious mind before, the first time the client works with the unconscious mind, they're getting answers from a small voice which perhaps has been ignored or which they think has been still for all of their life. And all of a sudden now we're asking them to listen to this voice inside of them, which is, you say, when's the first event? And this voice is, a little voice inside is going to go 3 or whatever it does. And the clients never listened to this before. The clients never ever had maybe even never stopped and noticed any even internal process. So if the client says, I don't know when the root cause is, you need to play. In fact, one of the things I do is I even say, let's play a game. And you need to play a game with them maybe. If they persist and say, I don't know what the root cause is, here's what I say to the client. I say, let's play a game. Could we play a game? And the client says, yeah. I say, okay, so the first part of the game is that you have an unconscious mind. Is that okay? And they go, yeah, sure. So, okay, so you have an unconscious mind. That's the first part of the game. They go, yep. Okay. Second part of the game is that you can trust your unconscious mind. Can you trust your unconscious mind? Client says, yes. Okay, I'll play that. You say, good. Now, having an unconscious mind and trusting your unconscious mind, what's the root cause of this problem? The first event, which when disconnected, will cause the problem to disappear. If you were to know, was it before, during, or after your birth, take the first thing that comes up. And then you just pause. And you want it to come quick. I'm going to snap my fingers here. You want it to come quick, quick, quick. If the client sits there and says, well, now let's see. Logically, I think it should be, and that's all conscious mind talking. You don't want the conscious mind at this point. You want to have something come up very quickly. And the client says, whoa, I don't know where that came from, but it says, 6 months or in the womb or past life or genealogical. Whatever the client says at that point, if it comes up rather quickly, that's good. So you want to get the client communicating with his or her unconscious mind, and you want it to happen very, very, very quickly. Now, if the client says that it's both a genealogical and a past life, when you say, what's the first event, then you want to work with the earlier one first, the one that goes back the furthest, and you want to come up to conception, and then go back and pick up the other one and bring that one up to conception, and then come all the way back to now for the rest of it. I think whenever there's a major change, you want to verify conscious acknowledgement of the shift. When a major physiological shift occurs in the client, I think you should make sure to mention it. And what I say to the client oftentimes is, that was a big one, wasn't it? And the client will say, yeah, it sure was. So when the negative emotion lets go, you definitely want to acknowledge that it has definitely let go. Okay, so I'm going to assume now that you have the first event, that you've got the first event, that the client has given you the first event. You've elicited the timeline now, and you've got the first event clear in your mind. Okay, so now we're going to go on to page 78. This is negative emotions number 1. This is the only negative emotions technique we'll be covering during this tape program. Although during the practitioner training, we'll show you how to let go of negative emotions in 2 different ways, and also how to let go of limiting decisions. So the procedure here is now, and we're going to go right on. So the client says, it was a past life. And you say, how many lifetimes ago? They say 3. You say, good, okay. So now just float up above your timeline and over the past to position number 1, facing the past. And when you get there, notice the event and let me know when you're there. Now, I think probably you would like to have explained to the client where position number 1 is, or you may want to have, what I do is recommend to my students is they take pages 77, 78, and maybe even page 75, and blow them up and put them on a piece of poster board and put them in their office if you're practicing in an office. And just blow up the diagrams so you can actually see the diagrams nice and big. So page 78, you're going to ask the client to float above the timeline over the past to position 1. Now position 1 is up in the air above the event, but you're facing back into the past. And the arrow on page 78 is the direction in which you're facing. So you're facing back into the past, and the event is below you and in front of you, and you're facing the past. Okay? Good. Position number 2 is directly above the event, looking straight down on the event. And the script says, now float to position number 2, directly above the event, so you're looking down on the event. Ask your unconscious mind what it needs to learn from the event, the learning of which will allow you to let go of the emotions easily and effortlessly. Your unconscious mind can preserve the learnings so that if you need them in the future, they'll be there. Now we wait. We wait for the unconscious mind to get some learnings. Now, most clients get learnings rather quickly. Some clients don't get any new learnings. What does that mean when they don't get new learnings? In timeline therapy, we take it to mean if they didn't get any new learnings that they already had sufficient learnings to let go of the negative emotion. And so we don't really wait around forever if they don't get learnings. We simply go to position 3 and we see if the emotions disappeared. If the emotions do disappear when the client gets to position 3, then for sure they've got enough learnings. And if the emotions do not disappear when they get to position 3, then obviously more learnings are necessary, so we could get some more learnings before we let it go. So now float to position 2 directly above the event, so you're looking down on the event. Ask your unconscious mind what it needs to learn from this event, the learning of which will allow you to let go of the emotions easily and effortlessly. Your unconscious mind can preserve the learnings so that if you need them in the future, they'll be there. The client gets the learnings and you say, good, now float to position 3 so you're above the event and before the event and you're looking toward now. Make sure you're well before any of the chain of events that led to that event and ask yourself, now where are the emotions? Technically what should happen in position 3, now position 3, let's look and see what that looks like on the diagram here. Position 3 is above the event, but we've turned around 180 degrees. So we're facing 180 degrees in the other direction. We've actually turned back around. So we were facing into the past when we started off on our journey on the timeline. We're facing into the past. Now we're above the timeline looking straight down on it in position 2, but by the time we get to position 3, we've turned around as if we're ready to come back to now, and we're facing toward now. So technically the past is going to be behind us and the future in front of us, and the event is going to be directly below us and in front of us in position 3. And what we're saying is, now where are the emotions? Technically in position 3, the emotions should just disappear. The emotions will disappear, by the way, and they always disappear. I've got good news and bad news. The good news is that we've been doing timeline therapy since we began some of the first experiments on it in 1984. I've been doing it in groups since 1989, and for years and years and years now, and the fact is that the emotions always disappear. I began doing some of the first individual sessions in 1985, 86, and 84, and quite frankly, all of the emotions disappear. They just always disappear if 3 conditions are met. We'll get to those in just a moment. But let's assume for a moment that the emotions did disappear. If the emotion did disappear, step number 4 is to float down inside the event, into position number 4, looking through your own eyes, and check on the emotions. Are they there, or have they disappeared now? Good. Go back to position 3. Now, if the emotions disappeared, most excellent. If the emotions didn't disappear, then there's only 3 reasons why they didn't disappear, and we'll get to those in a moment. That's the same thing. That's the same answer as what would happen in number 3 if the client said, no, they're not all gone. But assuming they all disappeared and assuming the client tested and they all disappeared, what we say to the client now is come back to now above your timeline only as quickly as you can let go of all of the, and then you want to name the emotion you're working on the events all the way back to now. Assume position 3 with each subsequent event, preserve the learnings, and let go of the emotion, whatever emotion you're working with, all the way back to now. When the client is done, you say float down into now and come back in the room. And then you do a break state. One of my favorite break states is, yeah, you know, you smell popcorn? And that's kind of a fun one because most everybody loves popcorn and most everybody will sniff for it to see if it's there. All right, so client's back at now, and we're going to test. And we're going to test, and we're going to test the number of times till we fill up the convincer. So you say, can you remember any event in the past where you used to be able to feel that old emotion? Now, here's the thing about timeline therapy. If the emotion's gone, it's gone. If it ain't gone, it ain't gone. We don't want to convince the client that if an emotion's not gone, we don't want to convince the client it's gone. No, if it isn't gone, it really isn't gone. So we simply say to the client, here, can you go back to any event in the past where you used to be able to feel that old emotion, and go back and notice if you can feel it, or you may find that you cannot. We want to test, and we want to continue to test. You might want to even write this right next to step number 6 test here. We want to test until the client is convinced and they convince us that there's no more negative emotion. See, I want the client to be so convinced. I'm going to say to the client, well, how is this possible? You sat here with me for 5-10 minutes and the emotion all disappeared. How is that possible? You've had that emotion for so long, your whole life. How is it possible in 10 minutes the emotion just disappeared? By the way, I say 10 minutes because let me give you the worldwide average. I've been doing this. I actually was very, very lucky to have a Secret of Creating Your Future seminar. And the Secret of Creating Your Future seminar, I've been doing it now since 1989 on a regular basis with students and clients all over the world. And quite frankly, it gave me a real solid knowledge base, a real large number of people that I've worked with. And what's happening currently is that it takes about 10 minutes for a person to let go, about 80% of the people on the planet, whether it be in Europe, in the UK, in Canada, North America, anywhere in the world, everywhere in the world I've talked to, it takes about 10 minutes to let go of a negative emotion for about 80% of the people. In other words, 80% of the people will let go of all of their anger from the past in about 10 minutes, or all of their sadness, or all of their fear, or all of their guilt. It takes about another 5 minutes, so a total of 15 minutes, for the rest of the people, up to about 98% of the people. So that means about 15 or 18% of the people will take 15 minutes to let go of all of their negative emotion, whatever negative emotion it is you're working on from the past. And there will be one other group of people, about 2% of the people, who will take as much time as you give them, up to 2 hours. So the reason I say 10 minutes is because that's most of the people, about 80% of the people, will let go of all of that negative emotion as they come back to now in about 10 minutes. If your client takes longer than 15 minutes, a little alarm ought to go off inside of your head. It ought to go ding, 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 ding. Time to ask the client a question. As they're coming back to now, you ought to say, how's it going? If a client says, because probably what's going to happen is if a client's taking more than 10 minutes to come back to now, they're probably stuck at a certain negative emotion. Okay, so I say 10 minutes and you say to the client, so it took you 10 minutes, how could all your negative emotions be gone? Test again, because I'm not totally convinced they're gone. And so the client tests again and they say, no, they're gone. So test again, test again. And I want the client now to convince me that they're gone. I want to be the doubting Thomas that says, how could they possibly be gone? And I want the client to really go back and test and test and test. You'll see a nice demonstration of this at the practitioner training. Okay, number 7, future pace. And you say to the client comes back to now at the end of number 6. And you say to the client, with the client back at now, I want you to go out into the future to an unspecified time in the future, which if it had happened in the past, you would have felt inappropriate or unwarranted, and then you name the emotion. And notice if you can find that old emotion, or you may find that you cannot. So you say that to the client and ask them to see if they can find that old emotion. And this sets up a recovery strategy. Now, if the client can find the emotion in the future, but not in the past, then you may have other emotions in the past to let go of. But the future pace, generally, if the test at step number 6 has gone well, there shouldn't be any problem with number 7. And so you have the client and you build in a recovery strategy where they have a time in the future where and notice it says inappropriate or unwarranted type of that emotion. Be very careful to make sure the client is testing for inappropriate or unwarranted emotion. Let me give you an example. I one time was working with a client and we got rid of sadness. And so I said to the client, okay, so can you imagine a time in the future which if it happened in the past, you would have felt inappropriate or unwarranted sadness? And he said, no, I'm still feeling sadness. And I said, so what is the event you're imagining in the future? And the client said, well, I'm imagining the death of a loved one. And I said, well, that's appropriate sadness. That's appropriate sadness. That's because I think if a loved one dies, you do want to be sad. And he said, oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. So he said, okay. So then he tested for something inappropriate. And of course, there was no sadness there. So if a client says they find something in the future where they're testing, you got to make sure that it's not inappropriate or unwarranted sadness. You want to make sure, in other words, you want to make sure that you're testing appropriately. Okay, good. And then you say, come back to now. Now, if the emotion does not disappear at either step number 3, or if it's still present in step number 4, let's go to page 79 now and see what we're. So page 79, these are the 3 things to check at position 3. The truth is that the client really needs to be in position 3. The indicator that the client's not in position 3 is the client's really feeling the emotions. So the client, in this case, the client will probably go back to position 3 from position 2. They'll go back to position 3, and you say, go back to position 3, so you're above the event and before the event, and you're looking toward now. At that point, you may see the client slump down in their chair, or they may go, oh, like that. Or you may see a wrinkling of the brow, or a squinching of the eyes becoming shut more tightly. And at that point, you say to the client, so, what's going on? And the client may say, oh, I'm really feeling the emotions. If at any point the client's really feeling the emotions, they're not in position 3. Okay, this is a rule of thumb. If the client's feeling the emotions, when they're in position 3, if the client's feeling the emotions, guess what? They're not in position 3, which means they've drifted into position 4, they've gotten too close to the memory, or they're somewhat close to it. In this case, you say to the client, you've got to get up higher and you've got to float farther back. Get up higher and float farther back. Get up high enough and far enough back until the emotion disappears. You want to have the client get up higher and higher and far enough back so that the emotion totally disappears. If the client doesn't get up high enough and doesn't get far enough back, then sometimes the emotions can provide a kinesthetic drag to the memory, and then they'll be held onto. They won't let go of as easily as they could. If the emotions get dragged, kinesthetically, and get attached there, they're just not going to let go. So if the client's really feeling the emotions, that's an indicator that you should have the client get up higher and get back farther. Looking at page 77, we also notice that there's a first event and there's a significant event. And the number 2 on page 79 says make sure the client's before the first event. If the client's not before the first event, then it's quite possible that 90% of the emotions will release, but not the other 10% of them. Look at the diagram on page 77. Let's see why. Well, if we look at the diagram on page 77, we've got a significant emotional event here. You see the significant emotional event. But let's say we're working on that event, which we think is the first event. But there's 4 events back into the past, further back into the past, from the significant emotional event. And the client is not aware of those. So you can see how, if looking toward now, you can see how maybe 90% of the emotion would drop off of that, since the first 4 events were not significant, but that it wouldn't all disappear. So if 90% of the emotions release and the client says, yeah, they're almost all gone, that's a pretty good indicator, that's a pretty good tip-off that the client's not before the first event. They're in position 3, okay, but they're not before the first event. So then you say to the client, are you before the first event? And the client says, well, I don't know. And you say, is there an event earlier than this one? Go back before the first one. So the client floats back before the first event, and then they let the emotions go. And then number 3, it must be totally agreeable with all of the unconscious mind to let go of the emotions. And an indicator here would be the client would say, the emotions are not releasing. So then you ask the client, what is there to learn from this event? If you learn this, won't it be better than having the old emotion? How can you get the same benefit that the emotions provided when you let them go? See, the situation here is that you have to reframe the client. And we've talked about reframing in the previous 2 programs. But we've given you also some general reframes here starting on page 80. So let's look at page 80 and see what the general reframes are. If you look at page 80, the general reframes essentially are the first one based on learning. What is it to have learned from this event, the learning of which will allow you to easily let go of the emotions? Won't it be better to preserve the learnings than the emotions? If you let go of the emotions and preserve the learnings, you will have learned what you needed. Or you could say, the negative emotion of frustration doesn't protect you, or the negative emotion of anger, sadness, fear, guilt, whatever. If you're working with anger or fear, you can mention the fight or flight response. So let me talk for a moment about that. It's the fight or flight response in the human nervous system that protects us. It's not anger or fear. Anger and fear actually serve no protective function. If your client has had an experience of, let's see, in the past, of being threatened and then getting out of there, and by the way, many people have. So you're threatened, you're in a really tight situation or tough situation. You're threatened and you choose, the fight or flight response kicks in and you choose flight. And then you get out of there safely. And what happens is oftentimes you get afraid afterward. Have you ever had a situation like that? I have, certainly, where I was threatened and I got out of there, and then afterward I went, ah, and got really afraid. So in that case, the fear served no protective function. In fact, it came after I was out of there and after I was safe. So in that case, there's no protective function in the fear. Now, anger is the same way. Anger serves no protective function either, although the client may think they need it, but the fact is it's the fight or flight response that protects them. And the negative emotions aren't safe for the body. The negative emotions really are not safe for the body. Every single negative emotion can contribute to a different kind of health problem. Anger has been implicated in heart attack and heightened cholesterol. Sadness has been implicated in weakened immune system and depression. Fear has been implicated in excessive stress and PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as phobia. Guilt in terms of lowered healing energy, and conflict has been implicated in terms of cancer. If you want to find out more about that, you can read the Journal of the American Medical Association and just go back to the JAMA and do a word search for anger and then disease, or anger and sadness and fear as negative emotions and health problems. And you'll find some really, really interesting articles which seem to implicate those negative emotions. So having explained the fight or flight, here's how you explain fight or flight. So a client comes or someone comes and they are threatened, and the fight or flight response kicks in. If you choose flight, you get fear, and if you choose fight, you get anger. So the flight or fight response actually will determine which side of the flight or fight response you choose, will actually determine what negative emotion you get. And it's not the negative emotions that protect you, it's the fight or flight response. Having said that to the client can then let go of the negative emotions from the past. Oh, here's one other thing. And please, please, please listen carefully and get this. Letting go of negative emotions in the past does not mean that the client won't be able to have negative emotions in the future. I promise you, if you let go of the negative emotions in the past, you will clearly be able to have negative emotions in the future. Past negative emotions, letting go of them in no way stops the negative emotions from coming in the future. If it did, we'd be turning people into zombies, and we're not interested in that. In fact, if we could get rid of all negative emotions in the past, don't you think we would? Of course, and we do, but we cannot stop negative emotions in the future because, and think about this, the future hasn't happened yet. The future hasn't happened yet. So the negative emotions that we let go of in the past are just that. They're in the past. And we say to the client, won't you be a lot safer if you let go of the emotions and preserve the learnings about taking care of yourself? Number 3 is based on the prime directives of the unconscious mind. And you'll remember, if you go back and take a quick look at the prime directives of the unconscious mind, which are on page 13, you'll remember that prime directive number 8 is that the unconscious mind preserves the body. The unconscious mind essentially is in charge of preserving the body. Well, not letting go of these negative emotions does not preserve the body. I mean, to be honest with you, if you hold on to negative emotions, if you keep the negative emotions in the body, that clearly doesn't preserve the body. It clearly damages the body. And so we say to the unconscious mind, or we say to the person, not letting go of this emotion is in direct conflict with the highest prime directive of the unconscious mind, which is to preserve the body. This emotion, though getting results, does not preserve the body. It hurts the body. So won't it be better to get rid of the repressed emotion and get the same results in some other way? Now, the prime directives of the unconscious mind on page 13, you'll notice I've circled 1, 3, 4, 5, 7, and 8. And those are the primary prime directives which I would always talk about with a client when doing timeline therapy. I'd always set that up before I started doing timeline therapy with a client so that if I ran into any trouble, or if for some reason, if the negative emotions didn't release, that we could say to the unconscious mind that that not letting go of this negative emotion is in direct conflict with the highest prime directive of the unconscious mind, which is to preserve the body. You do want to be able to say that to the client's unconscious mind, and so I think probably the best thing to do is to cover those first. It's usually useful to give the conscious mind some understanding about what it is that you're doing. I think it's usually useful, and it gives the conscious mind sort of an idea of what's coming and what is expected and what some of the presuppositions are. Okay, so let's go back now to page 78 then. We would have come to page 80. We would have gotten to page 80 if at step number 3 the emotions didn't release, or if we went down to step number 4 and the emotions were still present and then we went back to step number 3. So at step number 4, if the emotions aren't released, you go back to step number 3. Okay? Make sure you understand that. It says, float down inside the event to position number 4, looking through your own eyes, and check on the emotions. Are they there or have they disappeared now? Good. Go back to position 3. If the emotions have not disappeared in step number 4, you go back to step number 3 and do that again. If they have disappeared, then of course you go on to step number 5 and you complete the process. So that's a tour de force of letting go of negative emotions and our introduction to timeline therapy. And our introduction to timeline therapy continues on program number 15. Thanks for listening to this one, and come and join us for the next one.